Good morning and welcome to the first of a two-part series of webinars on the topic of ESG, jointly hosted by Gowling WLG and LCP. My name is Jason Coates and I'm the head of the pensions team at Gowling WLG, and a very warm welcome. So today we're focusing on helping trustee boards start your ESG journey, and in September at our second webinar we'll be looking at best practice implementation of ESG. What does good really look like? Today we'll be demystifying ESG for you. We'll be making ESG simple and accessible as you set out on your journey to integrate ESG into your central investment decision making, in line with, as you'll see later, evolving legislative requirements and best practice. I'm delighted to introduce to you a great panel of speakers this morning. Mary Verity, a lawyer in the Gowling WLG pensions team and a member of the ESG working group. Rachel Brome, a professional trustee with Best Trustees. And Ian Gaimon, a partner in LCP's investment team who specialises in ESG and related issues. So they'll each be doing a presentation to cover the legal perspective, the consultant's perspective, and the trustee perspective. Now on the screen you should see the slides, which are currently showing pictures of our presenters, and there should also be a small video of each of the four of us, and indeed a window into our homes. So let me just kick off by introducing you to the features of the platform that you have in front of you. You have a list of the presenters where you can access our bios and send us an email afterwards if you'd like. There's a resource list where you can see our latest thinking on a number of issues, and another box for direct access to our websites. But most importantly, please have a look and find the Q&A box where you can enter questions for our speakers this morning, and I'll be keeping an eye on that as we go through and passing your questions either as we go through the session or in a Q&A session at the end after our speakers finish. At the bottom of the screen, you can switch off all the fancy features and just focus on the slides if you want to. And there's also a CPD certificate if that's useful to you. Okay, so before we kick off with our speakers, we've got a few audience participation polls to do. And we're going to move to the first poll. Should be on your screen now. So which one of these statements best describes an investment strategy with ESG embedded into it? So is it one that applies environmental, social and governance factors as part of the assessment of investments to determine their future financial performance? Would you say it's the one that seeks to consider both financial return and social or environmental good to bring about positive social change? Or thirdly, one in which you apply your values, social, moral or religious, to your portfolio? Or all of the above, or none of the above? So if you can select your one answer and press submit now. And on this screen, we will now see how the answers start to come in. I'm starting to feel a little bit like Terry Wogan at the Eurovision Song Contest. The excitement is now unbearable as I watch these results come in. But an interesting question, and the reason we asked this was in particular just to see what people thought of different definitions, and arguments could be made, I think, for all different answers here. In fact, I can see quite a few people are taking that view. Okay, I'll just give people a little bit more time for the final answers. I think I probably would have gone for answer one myself. Okay, so interestingly, we've got a small group going for answer one, quite a few on answer two, but actually half of you going for all of the above. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so that gave us an introduction as to what we all think ESG is, and we're going to kick off now with Mary from the legal perspective. Mary, over to you.
Thanks, Jason, and hello, everyone. As Jason's mentioned, I'm going to be talking about ESG from a legal perspective, and I'm going to cover three main areas. So firstly, your duties when exercising your power of investment. Secondly, the recent legal changes on ESG in relation to SIP content and the new implementation statement. And finally, some of the changes coming further down the line. So you should be able to see Superman on your screen at the moment. Sorry, Spider-Man on your screen at the moment. You might be happy to know that this isn't for the complicated web analogy. It's about the tagline, where there is great power, there is great responsibility. And I think it's really similar to the language that lawyers use in this area, because we routinely talk in terms of trustee powers and duties. But the idea of responsibility perhaps brings into play the wider context in this area, and is one that I think we'll keep coming back to. For now, however, though, my message is simple. As trustees, you have a fiduciary duty to exercise your investment power in members' best interests. And what is clearer now more than ever before is that these best interests are best served by taking into account ESG considerations, because this has a direct positive impact on financial outcomes. So there's a lot going on. There's stuff coming at you from all angles. And we'll look at the legal and regulatory pressure in a moment. But I think the member and external pressure is really the bit that's driving change most quickly. And of course, pension schemes don't operate in a vacuum. The wider context has been highlighted really recently in the press by Richard Curtis. He is the founder of Comic Relief and a film producer, and he's launched a campaign a couple of weeks ago called Make My Money Matter. He's calling on the UK pensions industry to move its $3 trillion of assets under management into more sustainable investments. He's calling on you to take action, and you can see why. You, as trustees of pension schemes, have a lot of assets under management. You are major institutional investors, and collectively you've got great power. So, against that backdrop, just moving on to think about your obligations. When exercising your power of investment, which is a fiduciary power because you're exercising it on behalf of others, you're investing other people's money, you need to think about quite a few things. And starting to peel back the layers, at the very centre is your scheme rules. Now, you're likely to have a broad power to invest as if you're a beneficial owner, but you do need to check. Next, there are some really well-established principles in the case law that you need to be aware of, and I think these can be distilled down into 3 main points. Firstly, you need to exercise your power for its proper purpose. And of course, normally, for a pension scheme, that's to make sure that you can deliver pensions for your members in their old age. Secondly, you need to do that prudently. You aren't operating in a vacuum, so you need to adjust your returns to take account of risk. And thirdly, you need to take into consideration all relevant factors and disregard irrelevant ones. I'd expect that sounds pretty familiar to you. At this point, I feel compelled to mention Cowan and Scargill, which is the 1985 case about the Mine Workers Pension Fund, but only really to say that the case is often misquoted and paraphrased, and as a result, it's misunderstood. It is completely consistent with those principles. So, moving on to think about the legislation, which is perhaps a bigger culprit of any confusion in this area. But actually, you don't really need to worry about that, because following a couple of Law Commission reviews, the regulations have been amended a couple of times for the second time last year. So it's now really clear that your policies in relation to financially material considerations need to be included in your SIP, and that financially material considerations can include ESG considerations. I think there are a couple of key things to note here. Firstly, the investment regs don't tell you that you have to act on financial considerations such as ESG. The decision about what to invest in and why is still yours. But, as we'll see in a moment, you will have to disclose your policies on ESG publicly, and it might get quite uncomfortable to do this if the data supports that they are financial factors and your policy is not to take action based on that. So this brings me neatly onto the really big change. There is data available to back up that greener companies are outperforming their peers, that socially responsible companies is what the public wants. A few years ago, it might not have been as easy to prove that these sorts of investments did lead to better or comparable financial outcomes, but happily the world has moved on. It follows that if trustees are properly to discharge their fiduciary duties, because these ESG considerations are financial factors, they should form part of a trustee's investment decision-making and are not something separate or outside it. So, a quick look at the other recent changes in the legislation and regulation in this area. As I've already mentioned, you now need to include in your SIP your policies on financially material considerations. And from the same date in October last year, you need to include your policy on stewardship. From the 1st of October this year, you need to include your policies relating to asset managers. Ian is going to cover what those requirements mean from a practical perspective, so I won't spend any longer looking at those. The other big change is around disclosure and letting your members and the wider world know what you've been doing in this area. If you're a DC or hybrid scheme, then from October last year, you'll have needed to put your SIP on a freely accessible public website. And DB schemes have got to do the same from 1st of October this year. Next, not only do you need to publish your SIP content online, but you'll also need to start producing and publishing an implementation statement, which is a statement setting out how you've been complying with the policies in your SIP. And I'm afraid this is where it starts to get a little bit tricky. And this is because there's a disconnect in the legislation between the requirement to actually produce an implementation statement and the requirement to put it online. And this relates to the fact that the implementation statement sits inside the annual report and accounts. And as I'm sure you know, the annual report and accounts only has to be produced within 7 months of your at the end of your scheme accounting year. But both obligations, so the obligation to produce and to put online, actually kick in from 1st of October this year, or start to. And it's the time lag between the two, so the time lag for the annual report and accounts that's causing some problems, especially for schemes who would normally sign off their accounts shortly after the 1st of October deadline. So, for example, a scheme which had a year end of 31st of March. And this disconnect has been subject to a lot of debate in the area. Of course, in due course, the requirements are going to work as they were intended to, with the publication of the implementation statement following on after the publication of the annual report and accounts. But there's a fix, or there could be a fix. We're seeing schemes that might be affected signing their annual report and accounts before the 1st of October deadline, so a little bit early. And this allows them to take advantage of the transitional provisions, which do contain a clear long stop date of 1st of October 2021 for publication of the implementation statement online. I think if you think that you might be affected by this, you should probably have a chat with your lawyers. Anyway, in practical terms, it means that the implementation statement timetable is roughly the same for DB and DC or hybrid schemes. One point of difference to note is that the list of the items that need to be included in the implementation statement for DB schemes is shorter. It only needs to cover policies on stewardship and voting behaviour, whereas for DC and hybrid schemes, the SIP will need to cover, the statement rather will need to cover how the SIP's being followed more generally and any changes that are being made to it. So these new disclosure and reporting requirements are facilitating the growing member and external pressure that I mentioned at the start. So just to pick up on a couple of other legislative changes which are expected soon, and you can see on the slide there. Firstly, we're expecting a consultation from TPR at some point this year about the new single code of practice, which will implement some of the governance obligations brought in by IORP 2. This is expected to explicitly cover consideration of ESG factors within assessment of own risk by trustees. Secondly, the pension schemes bill, which I'm sure you will have heard has recently been amended to specifically include some sections on climate change. These include a requirement for climate risk reporting in line with recommendations of the industry-led Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. Whilst the provisions of the pension schemes bill are expected only to cover larger schemes, the TCFD recommendations themselves are voluntary and cover schemes of all sizes. So I think the idea is that schemes are being encouraged, all schemes, to move towards standardised climate risk reporting. It's also worth being aware that an industry group has been set up and is currently consulting on guidance for pension scheme trustees to support them in adopting the TCFD recommendations, and that DWP and TPR have been closely involved in that. The final guidance is expected to be available later this year. I think that these changes evidence that ESG is no longer being considered as something wholly limited to investment decision making. So, to conclude, I guess I would say that whatever type of scheme you are, changes are coming your way. And these are being largely driven by member and external pressure, and this is supported by the legislation and also the financial data. And on that note, I'd like to leave you with a press quote from the launch of the Make My Money Matter campaign that I mentioned earlier. Our pensions are powerful, and we must use that power to build a better world. With that, I'm going to hand back over to Jason, who I think is going to take us through another poll.
Thank you, Mary. And it's clear, I think, from what Mary's just said, that the background legislative context continues to change and evolve, and is something that you as trustees will need to keep watching. So before we move on to Ian to give us the consultant perspective, Ian was keen that we got your comments on this question before he started to speak. So poll 2 is this one. What is holding you back on your ESG journey? Select each answer that is relevant to the pension scheme you represent. And for this question, you can choose more than one answer. So the options are lack of knowledge and awareness in the trustee board, not enough time set aside in the trustee agenda, not convinced it will enhance risk-adjusted returns, advisors not experienced or credible on ESG matters, lack of suitable investment funds. So, as I say, on this one you can choose more than one answer. Please select your answers and press submit. Okay, so as I mentioned, Ian was keen that he could see what it was that you thought were getting in the way before he talked through some of the solutions and options that consultants can help you with. And of course, as we can see here, it may be a combination of things that make that difficult. So watching the answers come through, this is also reminding me of playing Football Manager computer game many years ago when I'd set up my team to play the big match and then watch for 30 seconds as the match played out automatically until I got a result. And here we're starting to get the results coming through. I'm going to give people a bit more time to consider their options. Quite a split here. Actually, there's some votes coming in for all the different answers. Interestingly, so we're almost up at 50% for the lack of knowledge and awareness on the trustee board, but quite high scores for the not enough time and not convinced answers, and a few less, a bit behind on the advisors not being experienced or credible and lack of suitable investment funds. But interesting that there are people in the audience who, right across this range, picking up these various things which are potentially hindering you taking things forward. So I think we've got most of our answers in from you. Thank you for that. Okay, so just looking at that, as we see, we're sort of going down in order that they were listed. We can see the lack of knowledge being right up there at 46%. And then closely followed by the time, not enough time and not convinced it will actually enhance risk-adjusted returns, which is perhaps the most interesting answer, Ian, in some ways, as I pass over to you.
Yes, thank you, Jason, and thank you for the results on that poll. I think we're really helpful to see, and the top one, of course, lack of knowledge. So I'm hopefully going to tackle that right up in the next 10 minutes with 3 steps that are going to help you as trustees and advisors get ahead on your ESG journey and make sure that you're well placed to stay on top of those issues in what's a fast moving area. So starting with step 1, and this is really about making sure your trustee board has the right governance in place. And typically that means starting with training to ensure you've got the sufficient knowledge on ESG and stewardship more generally to make informed decisions, playing straight into that highest score on the poll where you feel you lack knowledge. So good news, you've made a good start by joining this webinar, so well done, thank you. And beyond this, obviously, as a trustee, you've got many other sources of potential help. So there's the sort of published guides, which I've pictured on the screen. lots of sources for that, but also you'll be looking to your investment advisors and investment managers. And it was again pleasing to see from the poll results that you felt that in general most of your investment advisors were trained and knowledgeable on those areas, so that's good to hear. Perhaps less obvious than those, many of you may have an employer or scheme sponsor with specialists in the business who can bring some helpful knowledge on your trustee board on these issues. So don't forget to involve them and think about those. So next up is making sure you've got a clear understanding of your roles and how you're going to delegate responsibilities on ESG. So for example, larger trustee boards among you may look to delegate to a subcommittee, or perhaps even a sustainability specialist if you've got someone with that particular knowledge in your group to chair and lead on that. Those of you with the smaller trustee boards probably want to maintain it across the whole board, but you'll also be more reliant on your advisors. Turning to policies and beliefs, as we've already heard from Mary, you should have from October 2019 a set of policies on ESG factors and voting and engagement in your SIPs already. So I would challenge you to just ask yourselves, are they fit for purpose? In particular, we know that the regulator is going to be scrutinising these more, particularly as they become published. And we've heard from, for example, the UK Sustainable Investment and Finance Association, who reviewed DC schemes SIPs earlier this year, that they felt most policies out there were vague and trustees didn't commit to concrete actions. So I think this is going to continue to be an area of focus for the regulators and industry. So what do? A good way to be on the front foot: run a trustee workshop or survey to discuss and develop a consensus on your investment policies and beliefs. And in a minute, Rachel is going to be talking through how she did that with one of her trustee boards to give you some insights on how that works. Final part of good governance is monitoring. So recognizing this isn't a one-off task, but that ESG needs to be integrated into your business on an ongoing basis. So 2 quick actions for you there. Make sure you include it in your regular business plan, and make sure ESG factors are included in your risk register. So turning to step 2, so you've set your policies. Question next is, are your investments being managed consistently with those policies? And for me, this starts with assessing your manager's capabilities. And on the screen, you'll see I've highlighted 4 areas that we at LCP use to assess this. So you've got under commitment, checking to see that the managers are genuinely committed to integrating ESG into their investment process. Examples of that being, are they signatories to the UN's Principles for Responsible Investment, the UK Stewardship Code, looking to see that there's not sort of greenwashing of their investment process. Under people, things like the senior management team, are they accountable on ESG matters? Is ESG included in training and development of their teams? Do they have a specialist RI team that the portfolio managers can turn to for extra help? On investment process, the third in that list, you're looking to see that they integrate ESG throughout, and ultimately, does ESG affect the buy and the sell decisions in the portfolios that they're managing? Finally, on stewardship, let's see good evidence that they're using voting and engagement to improve investment performance, that they're forming their own view on voting decisions. They've got robust policies in place on things like fair pay, boardroom diversity, climate-related risk, and not only the policies, but they're acting on those, and that there's evidence of collaboration with others to support that. So for you as trustees, challenge your managers on those points when you meet them, and also expect your advisors to be providing this kind of RI due diligence. On the screen, you'll also see I've pictured some findings from our regular survey of investment managers, RI practices. And that's just one example of the way we help trustees in this area. So just turning to the next slide, I find this really useful. It's a great way to get trustees engaged on ESG for their particular investments. And that's looking at what I've called a dashboard of ESG metrics. So I've illustrated here an example for a global equity fund. And that shows, as you can see across the top, key ESG metrics for this fund, including the environmental, social and governance scores taken from MSCI, and with that various climate-related metrics. So in the interest of time, I'll just pick out one from the center of that picture, which illustrates the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the investments of that fund. And here you can see with the numbers, if you can read them, they're quite small. The blue bar showing 105 versus the wider, broader index of 159, indicating a significant reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions for the investments in this fund. And apart from anything else, it just generates a conversation with the trustees. You can start to unpick what's behind these investments, what's driving these numbers, and lead on to some really good conversations with the manager about what they're doing, how they're thinking about them. And as Mary mentioned, there's new climate risk guidance coming down the line. So this is a really good way of getting on top of those sorts of things. Just going on to my final slide then, step 3. So you've established your policies and beliefs, you've assessed your managers and your investments against those policies. Are they fit for purpose? So is there anything you could or should do better? And if so, what sorts of things can you do? So I've presented on the screen that there's a wide range of options available to marry up what are your investment objectives and beliefs on responsible investment with suitable funds. And this chart just illustrates that sort of range. So it starts on the left with your traditional investment fund, sole motivation being financial gain. And I've put a standard index tracking fund within this, and I'm sure many of you will have significant allocations to funds of that type. So within that, there's no explicit account of ESG factors, and I'd argue that they're not going to deliver the best financial returns over the long term. Indeed, there's evidence increasingly that you get better financial performance from integrating ESG. And earlier this year, for example, Morningstar reported nearly 5,000 funds that they analysed. The majority of the ESG funds beat their traditional peers over periods of 1 to 10 years. So with that in mind, moving to the right on the chart are funds which introduce some elements to mitigate E, S and G risks. And that could be through the manager's own ESG due diligence on stocks. It could be through incorporating ESG metrics that we saw on that previous slide to screen out certain types of stocks or tilt away from the lower scoring stocks on that ESG metric. The point for you is that there's a really good range of options, both within active and passive investment approaches, to achieve the enhancements you're looking for, and at competitive fees. The investment industry is falling over itself to launch new funds and compete with each other on this. Moving further to the right on that same chart, you're introducing more specialized options for trustees, particularly seeking to capture opportunities. So you've got sustainable funds, and what they're trying to do is invest in assets which can be expected to win as we move towards the lower carbon economy, or perhaps you make greater use of efficient materials, stronger social aspects. And finally, impact funds, the last side on that chart, and they're in common with sustainable funds, but also looking to deliver measurable positive financial, environmental or social benefits. I noticed there was a question on this raised, which we'll perhaps come back to later. So the takeaway is that there's lots of options available, and for you as trustees, you can access what you're looking for. And particularly, I'd say for trustees of DB pension schemes, make sure you consider this for your corporate bonds. It's not just about the equity portfolios. So to wrap up, on step 3, check your managers and investments are aligned with your objectives and beliefs on ESG. And if not, make sure you review those and consider whether there are better alternatives available to what you're holding. So with that, I'll hand over to Rachel, who's going to provide her trustees' perspective on implementing these things.
Thanks, Ian, and good morning, everybody. I found when I first came to ESG as a trustee, it felt like quite a nebulous topic, and it was difficult for me to really envisage how we might accommodate it in a practical way, especially when a lot of the assets that we hold on the boards that I sit on, you know, they're pooled assets and very often index and market cap index funds. So it was a slow start, I think, before I really got my head around it. Before I talk through about, you know, a bit more about what we did on the various trustee boards I've worked with, I just thought it was worth taking a step back and reminding ourselves of the overriding obligation of trustees. In my view, it's about making sure that we've got enough money to pay the right benefits at the right time. And investing our assets, we need to do that in the best interests of members and beneficiaries, which Mary touched on earlier. But that point about investing in the best interests of members can't be done at all costs. And as Mary said earlier, you know, as owners of trillions of pounds worth of assets, we do have a significant amount of power, and that we should exercise that power responsibly, in the broadest sense of the word, responsibly, and therefore take a balanced view of risk and return. And in doing that, we can then start to understand that taking ESG factors into account can actually be aligned to members' best interests. So the light bulb moment for me was really about understanding that environmental, social and governance factors can all be pretty much expressed as financial risks, be that not being prepared to transition into a low carbon economy, whether that's having stranded assets or where poor governance practices will impact the success of the company. And there's more evidence now that taking into account ESG factors doesn't actually detract from returns, and in many cases can enhance them. And Ian referenced that towards the end of his presentation there. Some fund managers have been able to demonstrate that their sort of ESG versions, for want of a better expression, of established funds have fared as well, if not better, than the original versions of those funds. So how do trustee boards move forward on this subject? For me, on the various boards that I sit on, training has been absolutely essential. And we saw in the poll earlier, didn't we, that actually, you know, a perception of lack of knowledge on trustee boards is what is holding them back. So training, of course, is essential. You need to understand the link between ESG and financial risks, and you need to understand your regulatory obligations. They're coming thick and fast at the moment, as we heard from Mary earlier. Given how much is coming down the line, and an expectation that I think that, you know, the regulatory pressure is only going one way, then training isn't a one and done exercise, and you will need to come back to it periodically as this whole area develops over time. Ian touched on developing trustee board beliefs earlier as well. It is a really useful exercise to go through. Certainly on one of my two of my boards that I sit on, we had that exercise and just challenges you a little bit to think a bit more broadly as to your commitment in this area. So you can determine through that, you know, what is your commitment here? Do you simply want to keep out of jail and do the minimum that you need to, or do you want to be a little bit more proactive, or a lot more proactive? You can then determine where you focus that commitment. Do you want that to be ESG more holistically, or climate related specifically? We heard from Mary that the pensions bill has been amended to make specific reference to climate change in. And of course, as with any other investment belief discussion, the active versus passive discussion isn't far away, and it's equally as appropriate in this area, because there are options out there that present themselves either as active solutions or index solutions. Again, setting beliefs as a board, I don't think will be a one and done exercise. I think it should be revisited periodically for a couple of reasons, really. Your own confidence in this area will develop and grow over time, and therefore it's worth coming back and just checking in that what you wanted to achieve at the outset is still appropriate. And of course, the landscape will continue to shift in the area. So those beliefs that you develop together with a good understanding of your obligations and the nature of the subject will then help you determine the strategy you want to take forward. Don't forget, of course, that any change in investment strategy will require consultation with the employer. And it'll be interesting to hear the employer's views on this from an investment perspective compared to their own corporate activities on ESG. Certainly one of the schemes that I work on, the employer was certainly in the camp of, we don't want this to impact returns in a negative way by pursuing an ESG type strategy. But as an organisation, they take their environmental responsibility incredibly seriously. So that could be interesting conversations for different trustee boards around the place. On a governance note, trustee governance rather, each of the boards that I've worked on, we've dealt with this at a board level, full board level, as opposed to subcommittee. Now, that's just the way we have chosen to work, and I don't think there's necessarily one particular right answer to it, and you have to determine what the right approach is for your own D board in that regard. So, moving on to putting this in action then. Even if you're a board that simply wants to stay out of jail, there are a lot that you can and should be doing. At the very least, you should understand each investment manager's responsible investment activity. Ian referenced that earlier on. That includes their engagement programme and their voting strategy record. And you need to consider whether they align with your expectations. Now, even if a lot of trustee boards will remain invested in market cap index funds, those managers can and should be wielding their influence through engagement and voting. Saw a question earlier about investment manager research into sort of the quality. There's an argument for exclusion, undoubtedly, but actually there's an argument for influencing from inside, and therefore there is a big role for index managers to play in this area. It surprises me, actually, the variation in approach of index managers. There are some very, very good managers out there that have extensive engagement programs and vote all of their shares, for example, and other managers out there for whom those activities are actually really rather light. As their clients, this is we can push them on this and really demand better in that regard, and we should use our influence as best we can in that area. The other thing that you can do, and again, Ian referred to this earlier, is to seek independent assessment of your investment manager's approach to ESG. LCP do their periodic research, and other advisors will do the same too. I think that's just a useful sort of check-in to see what the independent sort of knowledgeable view of those managers is, which will help understand where your own manager sits within that sort of those different areas. In terms of your own board governance, again, going back to my points about training and assessing your beliefs not being one and done. This thing isn't going to go away, and I think it needs to be very clearly managed through your risk register and your business plan, and make sure that you do come back to it periodically. And lastly, even if your ESG expectations remain at a fairly low level in the kind of keep out of jail camp, then you can factor whatever those expectations are when you come to appoint a new manager, for whatever reason that you're doing that in the course of your business. And of course, don't forget your disclosure obligations. But of course, some boards will want to do a lot more from the off, and some boards over time will arrive at a place where they want to do more. So that's where you can start to be a lot more proactive in your approach. You can actively decide to remove managers if they don't meet your expectations. I've already talked about, the difference in approach of ex-managers. You can start to pursue strategies with specific ESG focus, whether you do that more broad across the three elements broadly, or whether you go down the climate change element specifically. Again, do you want to do that using active management or index management? There's lots of index funds being developed now that have, for example, climate tilt or other ESG tilts that you can look at. The response in the industry to this continual ramping up of regulatory demands is evolving rapidly, and the universe of solutions is large and growing, and actually potentially confusing. One manager's ESG fund will be quite different to another's. Managers use different means of scoring ESG. You need to understand that comparing one manager's score with another isn't necessarily comparing like with like. So you will need your investment advisors to guide you through that, to find the solution that best sits within the strategy that you want to pursue. And of course, we should stay alert to the evolving landscape. I've mentioned it a few times. We need to monitor ESG, and the place to do that is through your normal quarterly investment performance reporting in any event, and making use of the kind of dashboard that Ian referred to earlier. Finally, and not insignificantly, we need to be prepared for member engagement on this topic. We heard from Mary earlier about the launch of Make My Money Matter with significant celebrity endorsement. I think that kind of campaign is going to herald a shift in member interest, particularly in DC schemes where members are actively making their own, or hopefully actively making their own choice about where to invest their money. And so the question for trustee boards then is how proactive do you want to be about member engagement? Do you want to go out there and engage with them directly, or at the very least prepared for more member questions in this area? Okay, with that, I shall hand back to Jason. I'll look forward to taking any questions later. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rachel, and many thanks to our three speakers, Mary, Rachel and Ian. You've all clearly given our audience lots to think about now, and everyone will need to be deciding what to focus on as a next step. And on that point, before we take some of the questions, and thank you for all the questions that have come in, we've now got quite a few. Before we go into those, just time for a final poll, just to see what, having heard our speakers, you all think you will be doing next. So the question is up on the slide now. Which one of these is the key immediate priority for your trustee board in relation to ESG? So is it holding a training session about ESG for the full board? Could it be asking your advisors to help you define your ESG project plan and timetable? Engaging with your investment managers to understand better their ESG strategies, their implementation and reporting? All of the above, or none of the above? So we're back this time to just one answer. So if you can select your answers and press submit. Okay, so it'd be interesting to see which one of these you all decide to go for. One of the things that we found in practice is that often it's just the getting going on the journey that is the hardest part, but that once trustee boards do have a plan and start work on this area, boards make really good progress quite quickly. And if there's anything that gets in the way of that, as was shown by answers to an earlier poll, it's things which are external to the board as opposed to the board's own position. And of course, as we've heard from all our speakers, this context of this ESG issue is something that's continually evolving. And so it's a case of moving forward. I don't think anyone's going to reach a destination on it just yet. It is a journey, and it's a question of taking that journey forward. I'm just going to give people a little longer to answer the question. As we just look through how the answers are coming in, we can see that the highest answers so far look like being the engagement with the managers to understand better their strategies, and all of the above. And actually, we've had, as I said, quite a lot of questions now in, and some of those have been about managers. And I shall ask the panel in a moment a bit about how they feel the managers are doing in responding to the challenge themselves. And we've also had some interesting questions around what difference pension schemes can make, either because perhaps their schemes aren't consolidated enough to make a difference, or indeed another question which just challenges about how much pension schemes can make a difference, being a relative, just a proportion of investors in the country. So we should come on to some of those in a moment. But just finalising where we've got to on the poll, there we go. So we've got a few people who are going to just under 20% holding a training session, 20% getting their advisors to plan the journey, a larger proportion, perhaps a little further down the journey already, getting involved with investment managers, and quite a few of you thinking actually your speakers have prompted you into doing all of the above. So thank you very much for those answers. So clearly from all of that, you're all going to be very busy. We got time now for some questions for the panel. So I'm going to start, please, by asking Ian, first of all, in relation to that question about the managers, and in particular, how well, Ian, do you think the managers are doing in helping trustees? Someone mentioned some recent cases of companies that got into trouble, and wondering whether actually the ESG procedures that those managers had in place would have kept them divested from those troubled companies. Ian.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And this, particularly plays to the outcome of that last poll, where most of you were wanting to now, on the back of this, engage with your managers and find out more. So in answer to the question, there is a real diversity of what you see among the investment managers, from what you'll see on the passive managers, and they're, by their nature, having to rely on things like MSCI's metrics rather than talking and engaging with the companies that they invest in directly, through to the active managers, where if you've got a very concentrated portfolio of, say, 40 stocks, those managers I've seen and speak to are having regular conversations with the company management, so they really get under the skin. Some of them don't focus on the ESG issues, and they're the ones we have concerns with, and they will score poorly and when we rate them. Others are very good at unpicking and even sort of going to a kind of thematic approach. So they'll take a topic like cybersecurity for a year, and they will challenge all of their target companies on those issues to find out what they're doing. So things like, you mentioned Boohoo, very topical for its concerns over, poor labour treatment of the people in Leicester, and Wirecard, where we've obviously had the fraud scandal. Pleased to say many of the managers that we recommend aren't invested in that unless they're passive. But critical that those investment managers are challenged on how they tackle things like labour standards within the companies they're investing in. For Boohoo, for example, and on the governance side, relating to Wirecard, are they looking at independent board governance? Insights from them. So ultimately, it's about making sure you challenge your managers, find out how they are tackling those sorts of issues. Are they getting access to the company's management team.
Thanks, Ian. And Rachel, maybe just turning to you from the trustee perspective in terms of the help you're getting from managers. What's your experience so far, and what do you think trustees should be pushing for?
Certainly from my point of view, where we're going with this is each time we get a manager in for their normal periodic come in and chat and tell us about how you're getting on kind of thing, we do specifically ask them to talk about their responsible investment activities. Some are better at doing that than others. One I specifically recall, I won't necessarily name names, but they gave a good story, but actually there was transparency that wasn't there. And what helps us as trustees is to understand some of the stories behind the engagement. So, here's a particular company that we've had engagement with. These are the issues that we talk to them about, and this is the outcome of that conversation. And that, for me, is what helps trustees get their heads around this stuff a little bit better. It's all very well to, oh yes, we talked to 58 different investee companies over the last quarter, and we've voted on 30% of the shares that we. So that's all well and good, but actually hearing the stories is more helpful. So we're starting to push the managers that we talk to tell us those stories and help our understanding of how this really does start to make a difference.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Just taking a slightly different tack, we've had a few questions come in around the difference of approach between DB and DC. Mary, perhaps I can ask you, if there's anything in particular you think ought to be pulled out in terms of the distinction in relation to this, or not?
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, sure. Happy to take that question. I think fundamentally, the obligations on DB and DC scheme trustees are exactly the same, certainly from a legal perspective. So it's to act in members' best interests, and it's about the financial piece. So these ESG considerations are financial factors. I guess I can see a couple of points of difference. There is a part in the legislation that talks about an appropriate time horizon. Potentially for a DB scheme, that could look quite different to a DC scheme, perhaps that's going to be around for a lot longer or has a different demographic. And indeed, the DB scheme that has a longer time horizon too, I suppose. And then the other thing, I guess, that's a point of difference is that for a DC scheme, you'd have usually a default fund, and then members will be able to be a bit more active and make selections on choices of where to invest. And so perhaps that could be an area where you could bring in an even broader flexibility in relation to things that are ESG and sort of beyond, I guess.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mary. And I'm just picking up on sort of where you went with that around sort of perhaps in the DC world, the member piece being slightly stronger potentially. Perhaps I could just come back to Ian just to talk a little bit about member consultation. We've had a few questions about, what does that look like? What do you do? How much notice do you give it? And does that matter as between DB and DC?
Yeah, thank you. That's a difficult question, actually, and one that I know that the legal advice can differ quite significantly. Because, yes, if you're going to apply what's called a non-financial factor or a screen for ethical reasons, trustees need to reach that view on the basis that there's a shared member view on that. And that can be quite difficult to form, because if you do a poll of everyone in your scheme, what happens when 40% say yes and 60% say no? What's the shared member view, or vice versa, the other way around? So you're faced then with a bit of a dilemma as trustees as to how you respond to that. And my general guidance, and each trustee will need to take this on its own merits, would be to look first for financial justification for doing these things, because the legal route is much more straightforward and less open to challenge. I think that there are exceptions, and I do have clients where we would do this, particularly those in the charity sector. So if you've got a charity, in a medical trust, then it's quite obvious usually that certain screens, like tobacco being the classic, would be a shared member view, because all the people working for you and past workers would generally hold that view. So I think for some areas it's clearer cut. Where you're having to go to members on a sort of survey basis, it is fraught with difficulties, and I would say tread carefully and see how you go.
Thanks, Ian. And Rachel, do you have any comments in terms of member engagement on this from your experience so far?
Yes, certainly on sort of DC schemes, we've gone out and surveyed members and asked questions along the lines of, sort of what's important to you, but also, would you be prepared to pay a little bit more in terms of costs and charges to get these kind of outcomes related to ESG, particularly around climate, and you tend to see that younger members are definitely more engaged with these topics, more so than older members. So that's interesting of itself. So we have done member surveys. It's then starting to sort of bring that back and work out what that looks like. I mean, certainly in DC, it's possibly a bit easier because you can have your default, which clearly a lot of the money goes into, but you can sort of make more available to members through the self-select range, which then allows you to, address more sort of ethical points, which I think was the end of the last point there. So it's possibly easier to accommodate member views in DC than it perhaps is in DB.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Rachel. So I'm just conscious of time. We've got just a few more minutes before the hour's up, and we've got some fantastic questions coming in. I'm just going to try and squeeze in two more. Ian, if I could just come back to you. We've had a few questions on the topic of ESG in the context of portfolios that are fixed income, gilt, and also sort of linked to that. How do you bring in ESG on choice of government bonds? I just wondered if you had a couple of thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. So where you've got fixed income, which a lot of maturing DB schemes would have, then I'd typically expect you to have some corporate bonds in there, and there's no reason why you shouldn't be doing your ESG due diligence in exactly the same way as we've talked about for those. Where it's government bonds, then ESG still applies, but probably less so on the UK government, but definitely more so on if you've got emerging market bonds in there, or other sort of sovereign debt, where you want to understand, what are the labour standards, what are the protections, what is the governance in those jurisdictions. Within probably the more traditional sort of gilts, and of course using swaps and total return swaps on gilts, you might want to think about counterparties and their ESG practices. So that is an area that if you've got a lot of gilt and pure gilt exposure and use of derivatives, you might look at counterparties. But that's, I think, an evolving area, and the managers will be pleased to hear from you and working out what their responses are.
Thanks, Ian. So one just sort of final question to each of the speakers, just to give me a short answer to, but it's an important question because a couple of the audience have posed questions which just perhaps challenge how much difference pension schemes can actually make, either because they make up a small percentage of the investor group, or because a lack of consolidation means small schemes can't make a difference. So perhaps Mary, starting with you, can pension schemes make a difference?
Yes, you're all superheroes. Absolutely. I think the company as well, I think there's some celebrities who would agree, and the growing external and member pressure here It's just one area, but it's not insignificant. So yes, absolutely, I think so.
Rachel?
Yeah, I do, and I think, you know, if we took the view that we've only got a you know, a small level of influence, and if every institutional investor, whatever they're doing, took that view, then nobody would make a difference. So I think we can and should make a difference. And also, if members start to see this through their pensions, they might then think about their other investments that they may have, and start to think a little bit more carefully about how they are invested in terms of ESG as well.
And Ian?
I think Rachel put it very well there. And the only other point I would make is there's a rising tide around the globe of this type of encouragement, regulatory movement, and public sort of demand and direction in that area. Greta Thunberg being the classic person that you'll have in mind. So it makes a big difference, and if we all are pushing in the same direction, then it will involve change and make change.
Great. Well, thank you again to all of our speakers. Thank you to all of you in the audience for being with us. You're clearly all going to be very busy. We're all going to be very busy as this continues to evolve. So that concludes our first webinar on ESG. We hope that you all now feel confident to play a part in developing your trustee board's thinking on it, whether as part of your overall strategy in a DB scheme or within the default of a DC scheme, and that you'll join us in September as we explore the best practice implementation, particularly coming back to that issue of engaging with managers. Thank you for all your questions. We've tried to cover as many of them as we could. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to cover all of them, but we will take a look at all of them after the webinar, and we will endeavour to come back to each of you with a follow-up. And finally, just your feedback on today's webinar is really important to us. It's really easy to give it. When the webinar finishes, you will get a prompt automatically. So please just fill in the feedback to the webinar then. It's done in a matter of seconds. Thanks again for joining us, and hope to see you in September.